the first part, we talked about IP strategies, and we found out that our strategies might have a sense if our IP has a certain value. So now we are talking about in this second part about the IP valuation. We're going to deal with questions like what is value? Why is valuation important? What can uh, be done in that? Uh, then the IP valuation is, of course, of a central importance when thinking about your IP strategy. So let's start with ask us some questions about valuation. The very first question is actually what is value and what is valuation? It is a very simple question. However, it might not be that easy to answer this question. Let's take some examples. Let's say you have a coat and it is really cold out there. What is the value of that coat for somebody who is quite rich, but he has nothing else in order to keep warm? What is the value for you in that point? If you are not far from your house and you know that you get home quite early. What is the value of that coat if, though you are not very far from home and it is cold, and you know that you can get home very early, this coat is something which belongs to your family since very long time. It is sort of heritage from your father or mother, or for some of your beloved ones. What is if it is actually uh, a present of your wife or your husband? So, what is the value of that coat in that case for you? Another example, you might have a house, and the house is actually quite well situated. You are in some place where you have good access to buses, and there are a lot of commodities there and so on. And you have a nice ocean view from your house. So the question is actually, what is the value of this house for you? What is the value of this house if it is the house of your youth and your childhood when you were born there and you grow up there? And now somebody decides to build, I mean, let's say the municipality decides that somebody is allowed to build a high building just in front of that house so that you have no more access to that view, that wonderful view you had before. So there is no more ocean view. What is the value of that house now for you? What would be the value of that house for somebody who wants to buy it? Because maybe I don't know, the house is still very well situated, the commodities are there, you have access to bus and everything. So what is the value of that house now? What is the value of that house now if you don't have any access to that view? And besides, because of this high house, everybody can see that you can swim in your swimming pool. But still, that is the house of your youth and your childhood. So, what is the value of that house for this situation? You see, in fact, the value which we are talking about is not only a question of some inherent, let's say, aspects of the good we are talking about, not an inherent aspect of the code, and it is not an inherent aspect of the place, of the material of the house, and so on and so forth. It will depend on a lot of other factors: situation, position, and the whole thing is also a question of context. So the central function of evaluation is to derive decision values. In fact, in all aspects we saw before, there is always a question of a decision. Shall I sell the coat? Shall I buy the coat? What is the value that I'm ready to pay or ready to accept for that? Which amount of money shall I accept in order to give that piece of, let's say, a heritage in a cold winter? So normally, this valuation comes when you have several options, at least two. There are situations where you have options to choose. What you do is evaluating that options and make a decision. So you see, valuation and decisions are highly correlated. The question is actually, when do you need evaluation? Especially in the case of business. There are certain occasions that call for calculating the valuation of a company, for example. Some of these occasions are, for example, if you're looking for investment, if you're issuing some stock, if you're forming employee ownership stock plans, etc. So you need actually, in all those cases, to know about the value of your company. These examples that we mentioned before cover some of the trigger events when you are required to determine your valuation. Valuations are useful in the beginning phase of a company also. Founders can find out a lot about their own company, customers and markets by having a general understanding of their company value. And they, on the other hand, business owners who are planning an exit strategy or a succession plan can also benefit from knowing the exact value of their company. So it is not depending on which part of the company planning you are. If you are at the beginning or at the end, you might need evaluation. However, did you know that the valuation can be used as a factor in your strategic business decision making also? And that is maybe the part which makes the relation to what we did before. This strategic decision making goes together with the valuation. Generally, business owners who are aware of their valuation are in a much better situation to make decisions regarding their business simply because they have an understanding of the true situation of their company. Business owners can use valuations for example, estate planning, determining life insurance needs, setting a buy or sell agreements, setting up incentive plans for the management team, uh, and even somewhat for more important than the rest is looking for a way to increase the value, the total value. This is true for the value of each part of the company, not only actually the tangible assets, but also the intangible assets, including IP. So the point is actually that due to the situation, if certain, you might be in some impossible situation. So normally, actually, this decision situation is somehow not that clear from the beginning. Why is it so? You shall, in principle, make a decision about something that would happen in future. So, if you want to sell your coat in our example or not, uh, if you know that actually the winter would be long and it will be cold the whole time, so it is not the only one you go out of the house. So the decision is maybe quite easy to say, no, I don't want to sell that coat even for higher prices because I will need it tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. If you know, for example, that the winter is just cold for 2 days and afterwards it will become again very, very warm, so why not to sell the coat? You are not very far from home. You can get home without catching any cold. The same goes actually for the house situation, for any other situation. Normally, this decision is done not knowing what happens in the future. So, in the case you have a certainty about future, the decision making is not that hard. It is a done deal. If certain, the decision is quite easy. Then the point is that most of the cases it is not certain. Then you have two possible outcomes. Is it a total and complete uncertainty, or it is risky? So you are, for example, in uncertainty, a complete uncertainty, if you are in a situation like middle in a revolution. So if you are in the middle of a revolution, everything is uncertain. So you don't know what the outcome would be. In most other cases, you are in a risky situation. It is not a complete uncertainty. So you have some risk and some risk valuation. If completely uncertain, you might act as a risk taker or as a conservative. So if you are, let's say, risk taking person, then you would, for example, try to take the case would have the best outcome. In the case of a conservative person, you take actually the least possible damage. If the situation is risky and you have some probability of outcome that can happen, then you can do a risk evaluation. Now, let's take an example. Let's say actually you have two options of investing your money in a fund, and at the end of the year, in the best case, you will win 200 from 100. You can actually invest 100. Uh, um, and then at the end of the year, you will win only, so by best case, you will win about 200. And in the worst case scenario, you will win nothing, zero. Okay. There is another option. You put your money in the bank, and at the end of the year, the bank will guarantee you uh, a win of 100. Okay. So the two options are that either I am in a risky situation and I take the risk in order to make some investment. Best case scenario, I will win 200. Worst case scenario, I will win nothing, zero. Or I go for a sure and quite guaranteed situation of 100 win at the end. So if you are in a complete uncertainty, the risks are can be anything. So you can take equal risks. So equal of winning 200 or losing everything and having nothing, zero. So in that case, if you do it, let's say risk evaluation, at the end of the day, you will win by a probability of 50% 200. So it is actually 50% times 200, that is 100. And then by 50%, you win nothing. 50% of zero is zero. So the expectation value is here 100 plus zero. It is about 100. So it is exactly 100. And if you put your money in the bank and you are guaranteed you are by 100, so in that case, you have 100 in both cases. Now, because it is in a complete uncertainty, either you are a conservative thinker and say, actually, that means that it is possible that at the end of the day I win nothing, zero. So I take the least of risks. I would put it in the bank and I am sure I will have 100. If you're a risk-taking person, you would say actually, yeah, in the best case scenario, I will double my win. So why not try that? So I will go for 200. So the outcome might be 200, might be zero. As I told you, statistically, the outcome has an expectation value of 100, but it is still actually the value you might have won by a secure investment. So this is actually if you are in a let's say a complete uncertainty. As I told you, it is not always like that. Most of the time there are some information available and the probabilities are none. So let's take the situation that is a risky situation, and then you have the probabilities that the market goes up, so you will win by a probability of 80%, 200, and there is a 20% of probability that the market goes down, so in which case at the end you will win zero. So now you can actually, knowing that risk, calculate what would be the expected value of these options. So with 80% 200, that is an expectation value of 160 plus 0 times 20%, which is 0. So the expectation value is in that case 160. If you invest in the market, and if you don't invest in the market and put your money in the bank, you will win always 100. So in fact, the expectation value here for the market is higher than the expectation value for the case of putting your money in the bank. So now another point which we want to point out in the whole situation is that the relation between IP strategy and the decision situation in the case of business are very complex. So you see, even for easier calculations, you need somehow some at least some knowledge about future, some let's say risk evaluation about future to make the decisions. That would become, in the case of IP, even more complex, especially in the business environment. So you cannot make a decision and try to implement your IP. IP shall be integrated into the decision process from the beginning. That was also what we found out at the end of the last module, where we saw that in fact the IP decision and the implementing the IP was from the beginning of your business plan. So you see, even statistically, that can be confirmed that the right way would be so around. Now, let's go back to our question about what is value and what is valuation. From that, what we heard from the beginning, from that, what we thought about the examples I gave you, we can derive only one possible, let's say, notion for the value, and that is value is a concept. This concept is quite different from situation to situation. So there are different standards of value. And that comes from the fact that the valuation would depend on the context. So you have to keep the whole context in mind in order to do a right valuation. Of course, depending on the context means also there are different methods and types of valuation. So you cannot, in fact, have a straightforward answer to the question, what is value and how do I do the valuation? That is, let's say, the message we will take with us for the next part of the same of this module. So let's keep in mind valuation is context dependent and there are different types and methods of valuation. We will see soon in which type of context, maybe which type of method would be the more successful or the more adapted. So let's ask ourselves why IP value, why IP valuation? Why does it matter to know about IP value and why does it matter to make some IP valuation? There are several answers to that simple question. First one, in fact, it is because of the increasing IP importance in firms' activities. So we have more firms, more companies that are increasingly try to bind IP in their business plan and in as part of their assets. Then, of course, IP valuation is likely to become a common accounting task because the accounting rules are changing from very conservative postures to a market value orientation. So nowadays, the people are not only taking into account the tangible assets as the value of a company, but the whole assets, including the intangible assets and IP valuation. Then it is quite good question to know how to assess these intangible assets because we might have a quite easy way to evaluate the tangible assets, but to evaluate an intangible asset is another type of valuation, which is not that straightforward, as we know with the case of, for example, a tangible good. On the other side, due to the changes in the use of patents or IP in general, the patent counts or is no more enough as an index for innovation. So having a large number of patents was used to be an index of innovativeness of a company, which is no more the case. We talked about it as we talked about IP strategies, about different functions of IP that is used today, that they are not no more only used as a sort of let's say protection of your innovation, but also as a sort of blocking for other companies to use their know-how. Then of course, improved valuation methods for IP can lower the cost of capital. So the better you can estimate your value of your intangible assets and IP, in fact, the better you can have an overview about the whole capital of the company. And then uh, it is genuinely have to say that an ex ante valuation, that means actually evaluation before everything had happened, that is in fact just an estimation, is much more difficult than the ex post valuation, which is basically just a measurement. So once you actually sold, for example, your patent, then you have sort of actually real measurement of that. So the point is that how this valuation is done is quite important because in most cases they are done in the situation we call it ex ante, which means actually before it happened. So, but where does the economic value of patents come from? So, uh, the private economic value of patent is determined by future benefits of that special patent. So everything what I say from now is of course concentrated about patents. It can be seen as IP in general, of course, but I wanted to concentrate on only on patent because it is maybe a bit easier for me than to give some examples. These future benefits, of course, results for the owner from the future success, which is based on the exclusivity which he can derive from his ownership. So, as you see, the main aspects are about future benefits, which is based on a future success, and these future success is in fact the effect that might come from the exclusivity you have through that patent for the owner of that patent. So a lot of factors are hidden in these only four notions. One thing which is quite hidden, but it's not even hidden, and you can see it, that's actually you have the notion of future. And we know actually now, and we knew it before, that what is future is at least not certain. So in best case, it is risky. So that that would say that these economic value of patent shall only be evaluated under certain risk circumstances without any certainty. Then, of course, what is very important by the patent and by the IP in general is the fact of exclusivity. And the other point, which is quite important, is the notion of ownership. Who is really the owner of that patent? These notion will come again when we are talking about some due diligence, for example. So, what are different type of value you might think of? Functional value theory says that you might find that there is an objective value. There is, of course, a subjective value. And there is, in fact, a third objectified value. So, what is an objective value? An objective value assumes the value as an inherent attribute of a good and that there is no interpersonal differences of value. So it means actually wherever or whoever estimates the value of that object, he will give exactly the same answer. This objective value is non-existent in fact. Value is intrinsically non-objective. As we have seen, it cannot be an objective, let's say, value. So the subjective value on the other side is the value based on the relationship between valuing subject and the good and is highly dependent on the valuation environment and available options. So most of the time, that is the valuation you have for yourself. The value of the code we talked about for you. That is your subjective value. And that is, of course, something which is existent. Each person, due to the relationship he has to that good, uh, might give a value to that good. So the value of your coat, in fact, for you, because of long heritage on the one side, would determine the subjective value of that coat for you, and the value of that coat because it is cold out there and there he has nothing else to put on, it would determine the value of the coat for the potential buyer. The problem is that the subjective values are not traceable and quantifiable for third parties. So just by saying actually these coat belong to my father, it is not quite understandable for the person who wants that coat and it is cold out there. So it is not quantifiable if you tell him why it is so like it is actually like that. So in that case, objectified value results from a valuation based on objectives under consideration of available options of the valuator. It needs the creation of a typical situation, of a typical expectation. The outcome is a subject related but comprehensible value. So good example for that is in fact that you might have a company and your company possess some patents and you need some loan from a bank. So the subjective value of that patent is not comprehensible by the bank. So what the bank need is to know what would be the value of that patents for the bank in case you are not able to, for example, pay back the loan. So in that case, you need an objectified value of that patents, not the subjective value for your company. And not, of course, the subjective value of that bank, because for bank, that patent has no value per se. I mean, the bank cannot use that patent. The bank is not in the same sector as you are. It is not producing in the same sector as you are. So if you see just the subjective value of that special patent or those patents for the bank, it is equal zero. However, it is a tangible value. It is an intangible value, and the bank can maybe find a value for an objectified value that you might reach if, for example, one day you don't pay the loan. He takes over those patents and he can give those patents or sell those patents to another company and in another, let's say, in the same sector. So you see what I'm telling here. It is about exactly what we said. It is about the creation of a typical situation, of a typical expectation. So the bank needs to make a typical situation, another company in the same sector, and the typical expectation, what can be the value for these typical other company for those patents. There are also different terms which have different significations. Those terms are, for example, cost, value, and price. Cost, value, and price are not the same, and they cannot be set the same. Each of them are relating to some other aspects. For example, cost refers to the consumption of economic assets, tangible or intangible, in the production and sale of any good and or any service. So it is related, in fact, to what you used, consumed in assets in order to produce and to sell that specific good or service. The value is a, a nominative structure based on nominative expectation. It refers to the significance of an asset to satisfy a subjective need. In our examples, it is the sum of future benefits discounted to a net present value. Economic values are no inherent values of goods, but values based on the effects and impacts that are determined by external purpose of these goods. That was actually what Bohm said in 1928. So uh, it is something which is known to economists for a long time, that the value has no real bonding to the inherent attribute of the good, but it always based on the effects and impact. One main difference between value and cost is that, for example, in the case of IP, that the IP in general and patents in particular are investment objects. An investment assumes the expectation of a yield or return in future, while costs are gone without any perspectives. So when you made some cost, you actually lost that money without any perspective. When you are investing in something, that is what will determine actually the value of that thing. In this case, actually, your IP. It is because of the perspectives. It is because of the future benefits. Now, to the last one, uh, uh, the price. The price of an IP asset represents the amount of money for which the ownership of that IP asset would be exchanged between a willing buyer and a willing seller. Price is the monetary amount at which an asset trades in the market. It is typically defined as what a buyer is willing to pay in an arm's length transaction based on his perceived value of the asset. The determination of price may be influenced by many factors, which include time, demand, reasons for selling, synergies for buyer, negotiation skills of the parties involved, etc., etc. In fact, the price is the outcome of a negotiation and refers to the exchange of value of an asset in monetary terms. So that means, in fact, you might have two different values: the perceived value of a buyer, and you have the perceived value of a seller. The longer the negotiation goes, the perceived value of the buyer may decline, and the perceived value of the perceived value of buyer might rise, and the perceived value of the seller might decline. So that at a certain point, these two value perceptions might cross. So now you have a real negotiation. And the outcome of that negotiation, what the monetary value is, which the buyer, in fact, is willing to pay, and the seller is willing to accept in exchange to that good. In this case, the good is actually the IP asset. Then you have the price. So you see, these three, let's say, different terms are quite different, and the perceptions are quite different. So we cannot directly let's say, uh, determine the value directly from the cost, and maybe also the price is not directly related at a moment, at a value for a certain moment. It is, of course, related to some perception of value, but is not directly. So you have to deal with these three notions, knowing they are different, and knowing if you use approaches using cost or using the price in order to determine the value, what are the limitations and what is in fact acceptable. So now, talking about the valuation. So one might say, actually, we might do an objective valuation, and this objective valuation, which is in fact uh, is granted by procedural quality and an objective behavior. You remember our discussion about certainty and uncertainty and risky situation? The valuation being based on future benefits. So we deal with future events. If the future situation were predictable in a certain manner, there would be no problem to evaluate. Basically, not possible in that case. On the other hand, if we are in a complete uncertainty during, for example, a revolution or so, no assessment of future, and so no decision and no determination is possible for obtaining a decision value. In most other cases, however, we are in a risky situation. That is, there are objective and subjective probabilities for the occurrence of a certain outcome. That means it is possible to determine a decision value. So we proceed to conduct an objective valuation by giving a guarantee on procedural quality through the analysis of the valuation task and compiling an appropriate valuation model. We shall also guarantee an objective behavior by applying a logical, methodological, transparent behavior that is comprehensible for third parties. We document and disclose all of the facts that serve as the basis to the valuation and assure the freedom of choice in the documentation. What result is the objective valuation and not an objective value. This objective value is basically non-existent. Valuation is a comparative process where a non-observable situation is compared to an observable situation. The evaluator estimates then the effect of the differences and proceed to valuation of future events. So whatever we are telling from now on is about the objective valuation. We forget everything about objective value, which does not exist. And these objective valuation need these, let's say, two guarantees: the procedural quality and also an objective behavior of the valuator. So now let's talk about the factors that might influence somehow the IP value. In order to do that, just let us go again one step back to the previous module as I talked to you about the integration of your IP strategy in your business model. There we talked about how a successful IP strategy shall be done and how to care for different factors coming out. We can now look at it from the other side. Now, once you have an established market, for example, what shall happen is that first of all, you shall have some, you shall use some function of the IP. So these use might be, for example, the blocking. These use of IP would then create an impact on the market. So the impact on the market has to lead to, must lead to some appropriation of the economic advantage. Once the economic advantage is achieved, then that would generate some cash flow, and these cash flow determines, in fact, the IP value. So you see the whole way around what we saw in the IP strategy. Now we can find it again in this scheme. There is a function. This function would create an impact. The impact leads to appropriation of the economic advantage that generates a cash flow, and that these cash flow determine the IP value. Uh, Among these all factors, some of them are the economical factors, as for example the appropriation, and also for example the cash flow. These are the economical factors. Some of them might also be relevant for technical or legal factors. For example, the function we use, for example, blocking, might have some legal aspects in it and also some technical aspects in it. Is the patent, for example, granted? Can we use it in the way we want, and so on? These are maybe certainties, uncertainties that we might have through the legal aspects and or technical aspects. So these are, of course, the factors that determine the value. However, which value? And that is also another question. What are, let's say, the constitutional body of IP value? Uh, IP value in general is set together from three parts. One is actually the value potential of the IP. The other one is actually the complementary assets of the company who owns these IP. And then the third one, that is the exploitation process of that can be used by the company. And all these together and how they match together would determine the IP value. Let me give you an example so that we understand what are we talking about. Let's assume there is a pharmaceutical firm that has a patent. Now, the value of that patent depends on whether the patent enables the firm to obtain the exclusivity. So that is the value potential. Then whether the patent relates to a marketable product. So that would be the exploitation process. If it is not exploitable, it's not a marketable product. So there is actually this part which is not fulfilled. And then whether the firm has the production facilities to produce the product. And these are the complementary assets. So you see that in fact the same patent, depending on who is the owner, would have different value. The whole IP value is determined not only by the value potential of the patent, that means the exclusivity, but also by the complementary assets which belong to the company and goes together with the company, and also with the exploitation processes where the company has access to, and how good these can work together. So, of course, a bigger company having much more facilities to produce, let's say, that product, might have, of course, a bigger part of complementary assets. The same goes actually for the exploitation processes and so on and so forth. So now you can also understand why the IP value of a very, let's say, genius person, just because the person had this genius idea, does not mean that the IP value in his hand are as valuable as the same patent in the hand of a big and international company. So one interesting aspect of IP value is also the usage of IP increases the value. That is called inverse value development of intangible assets through use. So there are a lot of examples of it. That is actually the example of patent trademarks. The more you use a patent, the more you use your trademark, the more valuable it becomes. So you see, it is not a tangible asset. The more you use your bicycle, for example, the less value would it have at the end. Here we are in an inverse situation where the more you use, the more value it becomes. So now another question would be, what are the different approaches you might have or you might find in order to do the valuation? The valuation approaches are divided normally in three different ways. So it can be a cost approach, it can be a market approach, and of course it can be an income approach. These three different approaches will be shown soon so that you see actually what are the differences between them and what are the similarities, and in which cases which of these approaches might be reasonable to choose. Cost approach. The definition of the cost approach is that the value of the patent is equal to maximal cost for procuring an equivalent benefit. So, in fact, you say, whatever I somehow spent as cost in order to do that patent, that is the value of the patent. It is, in fact, a very weak argumentation, because the more you spend for something, that does not mean the more valuable it is. It's maybe more valuable for you, but if we think about the objectified value, it is not correct. It is not understandable by third parties, and that was what we wanted to have. So the negative point about that is actually, first of all, which costs shall I take into account? Are there the direct costs, so the costs you had in order to write the patent, to in fact research and development, to find the idea, or also there are a lot of indirect costs? Shall actually I take all the indirect costs with me? There are also some historical costs. Is that the cost of the production? Or there is even another approach you can use it, avoided cost. The fact is that you can make a cost approach by calculating the cost you avoided by having this patent. So if I did not have that patent, I should have paid that amount of money in order to avoid that patent. So patenting around, finding actually re-engineering ways and turning around the patent, that cost, of course, and that is actually the avoided cost. Another negative point is, as I said, that the economic benefit is hardly related to the costs. So you might have actually some costs which are quite reasonable and verifiable, so you can find out how much was the cost. You can choose one of them: direct cost, indirect cost, historical cost, whatever you want, and you can show what it was. But does it mean that the economic benefits of that patent are related directly to that cost? I doubt it. I doubt it a lot. So does it make sense? Yes, maybe it makes sense, because the pro part is actually cost is, you can choose cost of an alternative, uh, uh, would give you a sort of upper limit by high uncertainty. What I mean is actually, if we are not certain about anything, at least the cost would be an indication what would be the highest, let's say, value in this in on certain situation. So the reasonable cases where you can choose this approach, the cost approach, is about, for example, when you want to evaluate actually patent applications, or you mark a patent valuation on patents which are an innovation in early stages. Or, for example, these are patents on products which lack sufficient market potential for the time being. So you don't know if there is something marketable come out of it, or in the case of patent application, you don't know if you would be granted the patent, yes or not. So you are actually in a total uncertainty. It is not a risky situation. So at least the cost approach would give you some, as alternative, some indication about the higher limit of the value. Then we come to market approach. The definition of a market approach is that the value of patent is equal to the realized price of a comparable patent on the market. Yes, it means actually, first of all, you have to find a comparable market, and you have to find a comparable, of course, patent. And then you will, if there is a market for patents, you will see actually how much they paid for that patent. And you would say the value of the patent, because of comparability, is exactly the same as this patent. Yeah, the problem is actually, what shall be comparable? Is it comparable parties? So both companies have the same size? Is it a comparable situation? Are they in a comparable market? They have to be actually on the same market. Or in the fact, are patents really comparable to each other? So these questions show that it is quite difficult to find something which will be comparable. And the other problem is actually, there is no active and transparent patent market out there. So that you cannot really find out how much people paid for something. You might actually have an idea, but it is not that transparent. And there is nothing like a patent market there. So good part would be, if there is such a thing like a market, the price on that market would be a reference point. But if there is, in fact, it is a profit-oriented method. The comparison is based on the profit made by third-party patent holders in the market. And then you can have also a royalty-oriented method. That means actually adoption of usual royalty rates for comparable patents, license, and knowledge. If comparable transactions in the market with matching indicators and economic environments are available, the method is easy to apply. And I have to say, there is normally no comparable transaction in the market with matching indicators. So doing this method is quite doubtable. But of course, if you find something comparable, if you know the price, that is a real indication. That is actually a fair price most of the time. So it is a third possibility of approach, and that is income approach. Per definition, the income approach is that the value of the patent is derived from prospective income expectations. So in fact, now what we do by the income approach is that we put together the value of that patent from what we might expect to earn through that patent. In fact, if you think about it, that is the closest definition of the value. The value is defined like that. The value is defined like how to decide about future income, how future actually economic benefits. Uh, the point is actually quite difficult is that the future is hard to predict. So you have this situation of uncertainty and risk. In the case of risk, again, you have the possibility of making some, let's say, risk assumptions. If the probabilities are known, then the expectation value is easy to calculate. And in the uncertainty situation, we are in an uncertainty situation, so it will become quite hard to find and to give a thorough answer to the valuation of that. Oh, so this method goes based on present cumulated future benefits. There are several types of these income approaches. For example, discounted cash flow, relief from royalty method, or postulated loss of income. So this relief from royalty method is the one that you might have heard most of the time, or you will hear it most of the time, is a method that calculates if I had not that patent and somebody else would have had this patent, I had to pay some royalty. So now that I have this patent, I'm relieved from that royalty paying. So what is the amount of money I save by having this patent, if you want? So that is actually the future benefit through the royalty, which I could have paid if I did not have that patent. So now to the valuation procedure. One might think that, okay, once we have a valuation model through the approaches we talked about, we can choose in which situation we are. We have actually a valuation procedure, valuation model based on that model, and we can actually calculate the value. Uh, the point is actually, again, value has a meaning only in a certain context. So the first thing that you can look at is the valuation context. This valuation context includes, beside valuation model, the cause, the purpose, goal, and the addressee. The valuation model on itself shall imply valuation object, value concept, and finally value determination, which itself might include obtaining information and on the degree of objectification which is needed. We are going to talk about that in detail in, let's say, one or two slides, but before that, I want to make clear what I meant when I talked about value standards. There are two very common value standards which in fact make clear in which context and situation we are. One of them is called value in use, and the other one is the transfer value. Value in use is defined by the net present value of a cash flow or other benefits that an asset generates for a specific owner under a specific use. In fact, value in use would say that in this situation, the complementary asset won't change. So you are in exactly the same situation when you think about the complementary assets as before. So, for example, you want to make a valuation for yourself. This is a valuation where you don't want, in fact, to externalize the patent. The patent remain your let's say your property, and it will remain in the same let's say complementary assets as before. Where transfer value is a concept of that takes into account a transaction oriented valuation. In this concept, the value is generated from an external utilization regarding the patent owner. So the fact is that here in that case, in fact, the patent is somehow transferred from one company to another one. So in other words, by the transfer value, patent is moving to new complementary asset environment comparable to market value. In fact, these standard of values are also known under other names. So if you look at it, you might find also the name of fair market value and fair value. These are the most commonly used instead of value in use and transfer value. When you talk about, for example, a fair market value or market value, that is defined as the price at which an asset or service passes from a willing seller to a willing buyer. The premise of these values is an exchange. So we are in the case of the transfer value as I explained to you. It is also assumed that both buyer and seller are rational and have reasonable knowledge of relevant facts. When you are talking about fair value or a fair price is appropriate for use in post-transaction purchase price allocation. The premise of this value is, of course, use. So we are in the case of value in use. Fair value is based on the assumption that market participants would use when pricing the asset, whereas fair market value is seems to be more appropriate when it is used in an exchange and in another complementary assets. So whatever you call it, if you call it value in use or fair value, transfer value, or for example, market value, transfer fair market value, the whole concept would not change. It is actually comparing two situations. Evaluation when of the same IP asset one time inside a company, and that is the value in use, and another time is actually the transfer value. It means actually you are evaluating the same asset, IP asset, patent, uh, after a change. So when it was given to another company who could use and exploit that patent. The value of an IP asset would depend on the context or circumstances in which it is being valued. For example, is it being valued in the context of a going concern, where it is alive and well and performing its job? Or is it being valued in a context of going concern, but where it is not being used? Similarly, In the case of liquidation, is it a forced liquidation or an orderly disposition of assets? An analysis of the valuation context will allow us to know the valuation request, the role of the valuator, and the given framework. For these, one has to analyze the four following questions. What is the cause of the valuation? What is the purpose of the valuation? What is the goal of the valuation? And what is or who is the addressee? So to each of them, I will give you an example in order to understand what they are meaning. The cause of the valuation. There are different possible causes of the valuation. Here, one shall answer the question, what is the reason of the valuation? And there are a multitude of possibilities that we can put them in 5 different categories. There might be some management-oriented causes. So the management wants to know about the value of the patent they have. Or it is an enterprise-related cause. So that is also a valid reason why a valuation shall be done. Is it a transfer-oriented cause? So in that case, you might want to transfer this patent to another company, to another firm. So it is actually a transfer-oriented cause. Is it about a conflict-based cause? So in the case of a conflict between two companies about the patent, the patenting value shall be estimated. Or it is for some finance and accounting oriented reasons. So these 5 categories somehow cover different possibilities of causes. For the sake of purpose, the valuator shall answer the question, what is his role? What is the role of the valuator? So it might be actually a consulting role. It shall also be situations where it is a mediation role, and for some cases it is a neutral role. The next step is about the goal of the valuation. Here one shall answer the question, which information shall be taken into consideration for the valuation? Shall I find a subjective value? Is it about an arbitral award, or it is about an objectified value? Examples of that might become clear when we think about different valuation causes. For example, if you are evaluating a patent for some management-oriented cause, you know that the value that you are estimating is a subjective value because you want to know the value for the company itself. In a conflict-oriented cause, for example, the value you find out is about an arbitral award because that is between two parties. And in the case of a transfer-oriented cause, where you want, for example, to evaluate the patent for the sake of a transfer, for the sake of a sell and buyer situation, it is an objectified value. Last but not least, the valuator shall know who is actually the primary addressee of the valuation. Here he shall answer the question, who will receive the value information and who is my primary addressee? In that case, it might be an internal, let's say, addressee, So that is the case most of the time. If you are thinking of again some management related causes, then you have actually an internal addressee, that is the management of the company, who want to know about that valuation. It might be an external, uh, let's say, addressee. So in case you make a valuation for a judge, the judge wants to know, in the case of liquidation, how much is the value of that, let's say, patent. In that case, it is an external, for example. Or it can be both internal and external addressee. So in the case of a transfer, when you want to evaluate the patent in a transfer case, where one company wants to buy the patent and the other one wants to sell the patent, so you have the primary addresses of both internal and external nature. So further, after the context analysis, so where we know now what is the cause of the valuation, what is actually the purpose of the valuation, what is the goal, and who is the addressee, the evaluator builds the structure of the valuation model by answering the questions about the subject matter, then about the decision, about the value determination, about the needed objectification degree, and last but not least, about the information that he receives. The result of the valuation is in principle a report about the value of the patent for the analyzed valuation situation with the considered valuation model. So without having all these aspects together, it means, in fact, without knowing about the subject matter, about the decision to take, about the value determination, about the objectification degree, and which information you can use and what is the quality of the information, you cannot do a thorough valuation model. However, the most important part is to document all that. I mean, the valuation context plus the valuation model in a transparent way, so that is actually reasonably understandable and verifiable for third parties. In any other case, you might go against a situation, or you might actually face a situation with which might have even some legal, let's say, burden for you. So if you are involved in some valuation, you might be very careful about all these aspects and put them quite transparently. So if someday some questions pops up about how did you do the valuation and things like that, the report can answer all that upcoming question. So before going further and talking about subject matter evaluation, I wanted to talk about two aspects, which is actually inside out and outside in analysis. Do you remember this slide from the strategy part? So we are talking about an inside out analysis when we come from the function to impact to appropriation and then deduce the economic effect. If we start with the economic effect, go to the appropriation, find the impact, and then the function, we are talking about an outside-in analysis. Normally, if you have an established economic effect, then you do, for example, premium price, then you do an outside-in analysis. From the established economic effect, you can deduce the appropriation through which impact that defines actually the function. In other cases, where you don't know if there is a real economic effect of the patent, but you have a patent, then you have to do an inside out analysis, which means you start from the function of the patent you are using that might define the impact, which would hopefully lead to an appropriation, and that appropriation would bring some economic effect. So when you're talking about the subject matter of the valuation model, the main question to be answered is what is valuated? In order to respond to that question, one needs to analyze the direction of the valuation subject matter. As I told you, it can be inside out or outside in. If there is an economic effect which is sure, for example, you have price premium because of the patent, then you can do an outside in analysis. For other cases where a patent is available without the sound knowledge about its possible economic effect, the analysis would be in inside out direction. You can ask yourself the questions as, for example, is there any economic effect of the patent known or obvious? Is it possible to deduce an appropriation mechanism from the economic effect? Is the patent directly connected to the effect via an already known mechanism or action? If the answer to each of these questions is yes, that is an indication of an outside-in analysis. Any no answer would mean that you might do an inside-out analysis. The next is, in fact, the decision. The core question is which decision situation is analyzed. Here, the evaluator has to answer the question about comparing comparables. So he has to define the limits of the model that he used. These limits also includes the temporal limits. As we know, for example, a patent will die after 20 years, so you have to define the time limit where you want to do the valuation. There is actually a time limit, a natural time limit for the patents, for example. Then you have to compare these things together, and together with the valuation codes, you will decide also about the value concept that might be used. It is either a value in use or a transfer value. So on the one side, you have the decision where the limits of the model is set. On the other side, you have the valuation codes, for example, management-oriented codes. Together, that will decide if it is a value in use or we are talking about a transfer value. For that case, for example, for a management oriented case where the management wants to know the value of that patent, of course, we are in the case of a value in use and not in a transfer value case. During this decision process, you have also to answer other questions. As for example, what are the action option alternatives? Which action options are to be addressed? You have to have at least two action alternatives. One is, for example, selling the patent, and the other one is another option, for example, investing in the patent or investing in some alternative. Then you have to think about the results, which economic results are achieved in these options. So what would be in fact the economic result if you further invest in the patent or in the alternative. Then you have to think about the environmental conditions, which impact factors are to be expected for the options. For example, is there any risk and uncertainty? Then you have to take them into account. You have, of course, to take into account the occurrence of uncertain and, let's say, happenings which are somehow together with some risks. And then you have to think about the value concept. That is, according to which criteria should the choice of the option be performed. So the specification of a framework for the comparison is here needed. And for the valuation is, of course, the maximization of the economic benefit. So the aim function and the value concept tells you, in fact, which one you have to take. So the on the other side, the value concept also, as I told you, is very important to be determined at this point. You have to determine if it is about a value in use or a transfer value. Otherwise, you cannot proceed to the next step, which is value determination and appropriations. After the decision step, where we found out about the value concept, now we shall answer the question about how is the value determined. So there are two possible cases. The case value in use. In that case, we start with the valuation object. So we identify and isolate the valuation object. For example, a single patent. Then the aim of the next step is to determine of a payment flow from the economic effect of that patent, that is, about the income. Then that would define the function which is used. We know actually different functions, for example, protection function, transaction function, strategic function, or other functions. Then after that, that will identify the complementary assets and external complementary factors which are necessary for the conversion of the patent. The next step is actually to identify the impact of that patent, and then we identify the appropriation, which means in fact we identify the mechanism of appropriation and thus the economic effect, which is, for example, premium price or market share. In the case of transfer value, it is quite analogous. We start with the valuation object, which is actually isolating which valuation object is considered, for example, a single patent. Then in the next step, the goal is the determination of a cash flow from the economic impact of the patent on that market. Again, that depends on the functions. Here is actually the transaction, normally is about a transaction function, and that identifies the complementary assets and external complementary factors that are necessary for the transaction of the patent, that defines, in fact, the identification of comparable patents and comparable transaction, and that would go to the impact, which we know already what it is. That is actually the impact from the analog transaction, what price, market, or a market position. And that would, in fact, bring us to the identification of the characteristic attributes of the appropriation in that case. So the value determination part is very highly dependent on the decision part, where you decide about the concept, if it is about value in use or it is about a transfer value. In the next step, the valuator decides about the needed degree of objectification. So this can vary from a subjective value in the case of management-oriented causes to objectified value in conflict-based causes. In the first case, the evaluator takes into account the individual possibilities or the capabilities and plannings of the company where the patent is evaluated. Where in the latter case, in the case of conflict-based valuation, these attitudes shall play a neglecting role, as you need to show an objectified value to the third parties so that the third party can understand how you came to that, let's say, result. Last but not least, we will talk about the information. It is important to know about the relevance, reliability of the info, and of course about the effort that the evaluator has to put in order to access that information. So who has the search burden, who has how much long is actually the involvement of the actors. So for example, if you are in a management oriented cause, in that case you have more or less relevant and reliable, let's say, information. Uh, we cannot talk much about actually the completeness of these information. Then you have a lot of search due to yourself, so you have to invest a lot of work to search for that information. However, you can be sure about the involvement of the customer because the management wants to know that value. On the other side, if you are thinking about a conflict-based cause where actually a conflict gave the reason for this valuation, you might have access to relatively and highly relevant and reliable information. It is normally actually a judge who decides that, so you actually have a good access to that. Normally, the information are quite complete, and in most of the cases, you don't have a high burden of search because these documents, these actually infos are per se given to you. On the other side, you can be really sure that the customer is not really involved in that data furniture because he is part of, let's say, a conflict. So he might not have really interest in giving you access to all necessary information. So all that had been said, now it is your duty to do the rest. The rest is actually once you know about the context, now what you know, which actually decision to make, what is the subject matter, what concepts of value you shall take into account, value in use, value in transfer. Shall you actually make an inside-out analysis, an outside-in analysis? How to determine your value and what is the degree of objectification needed. Uh, the rest is actually a calculation work. So you have to choose the approach you want. You choose the one which suits to the context and to the valuation model, and then you can put the numbers in that in order to find out what would be the value at the end. So there are several approaches as we have seen, cost approaches for certain cases quite good, market approaches if there is a market there, and you have also the relief from royalty, which is actually an income approach, or any other income approach, which are mostly used for these valuation models. However, uh, the rest of it is actually quite straight ahead. You have to put the numbers in that and find out a number at the end. But this number is not that important. What important is the whole report you put together. Is in fact very important that one can see from the report how you came to that number. What was the base of that valuation? What was the context? How you decided about that, and so on. And that is even more important than the number which comes out at the end. That is actually a computer can do it. It is not something you are very let's say you're very involved that, so we can actually put the numbers in that and the computer will give you the answer. That is not what is important. That is not the number which comes out which matters. What matters is actually how to come to that one, and that shall be verifiable. That shall be done in such a manner that it is somehow transparent for third parties. But I want not to close these talk except for these matter. So I have to say all I told you up until now is in fact that you can do it straightforward without any problem. The point is actually if you do it like that, you might have neglected your due diligence. That means actually you have not to forget to care about risks. So without due diligence, the estimation of your patent, the estimation of the value of your patent would systematically be too high. So if you want to do a correct estimation, you have to take into account also the legal and technical risks. You remember when I talked about actually the factors which influence the value of IP, I talked about legal factors and technical factors. Legal and technical factors are mostly the risk factors. So, and these risk factors would bring us to a sort of, let's say, discount by your calculation. So your due diligence is in fact to take into account not only the economical effects, as it was said up until now, but also to take into account that there are some legal and technical risks. So what are the technical risks that can happen? This risk depends on the status of development. So it means, in fact, you are in a high, let's say, actually risky situation if you are at the earlier stage of your project. So the earlier the stage, the higher the risk. So let's see normal project, let's say, situation. You start with an idea, then the idea would maybe give birth to a prototype that would come to a pre-series. Then you have the production start, a commercial launch, and then, of course, the market establishment. So if you are in the latest case, so if you are in the market establishment case, so you have an established market, there is no risk. There is, in fact, zero technical risk. You know that it works, you know that you can sell it, that there is actually in demand, and there is no technical risk out there. But you higher, the higher you are in that chain, the higher is the risk. So if you are, for example, at this stage of the idea, there are a lot of technical risks. You are at the highest level of risk you can imagine because the idea might work, might not work. And then if it works, would it be technically possible to do that? So if you are in a prototype, you should have shown at least it is technically possible to do that. But is it still much more risky than if you are in pre-series, where you have shown that in fact you can do it in higher scale? Then when you start the production, at least you're sure that you did a lot of technical problems. You have solved a lot of technical problems so that you can start that production. That does not mean that you can actually still sell that because of some other technical reason. Once you have the commercial launch, it is still a bit more risky than the establishment. So, in fact, you have to take into account in which stage you are. And that stage would decide about the technical risks. So, when you are in the situation of valuation, one thing you do is, in fact, first, the calculating of the economical effect as we have seen. Then you have to reduce it due to the technical risk. There is no technical risk if you have an established market, and there is a very high, let's say, technical risk if you're just at the stage of an idea. Now, you're going back to legal risks. What can be uh, 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 legal risk? So, one thing you have to do is, in fact, you have to clarify all relevant legal aspects. So, that is the completeness of the aspects. Then you have to also, when you are, for example, going to identify different legal aspects besides the completeness, you have to make sure that the aspects are somehow disjoint. They shall be disjoint. This second attitude, in fact, assures that no risk is taken into account twice. So if all the aspects you found are complete and you covered different possible legal risks, and then if each of these aspects is disjoint and not dependent from the other one, then you know by the risk calculation at least, you know that you did not take for one risk twice. And that is actually what you want. You don't want to underestimate the value as well. So one can think of different lists which are disjoint. That is actually they are not dependent among each other, and they are complete. I give you only one of these examples where I tried to put all legal risks that might pop up in that list. So there are actually seven in that case. The first of them is, for example, the status of the patent. That is, for example, you have to check if the patent is in force. Which countries are covered by that patent. So maybe actually you have a patent, but in those countries which is not important for you. So that is actually a legal risk. Then, of course, another risk is about actually a remaining lifetime. The patent in 19th year, and so it's just 1 year of lifetime. So there's actually very high risk. In 1 year, it will be dead. Then the second one is about the ownership and contractual issues. It is, for example, you have to know that in some countries there is an Employee Invention Act. just to give you an example, in Germany, for example, there is such an act. That means actually once an employee did an invention, the ownership can go to the let's say the company under certain circumstances, but the circumstances shall be actually fulfilled. So that is a legal risk if it is really done or not. So you have to check for that as well. Then the other one is actually about patentability, opposition, and invalidity. So very first question is actually, is it a granted patent or is it just an application? Um, if it is not granted, is it patentable at all? Maybe it is about a non-technical aspect which is not patentable. Then, if it is patentable, then can it be invalidated? For example, in an opposition procedure, is there any danger of any, let's say, actually opposition still validating? Or, for example, you passed that possibility. Then, of course, you might need a search in that case in order to be sure how valid that patent is. So that is actually part of due diligence. You have to search about the patent application which is not granted to be sure that or at which level the patent is new and inventive. Otherwise, you take the risk. Then you might have some business risks like freedom to operate. So can third, do you, by using the patent, eventually infringe third-party patents? Is it, for example, part of industry standards? Are there some legal restraints, for example, FDA approvals and so on and so forth? So that is especially the case for pharmaceuticals, where you need normally action and approval. That means that actually having a patent does not mean that you can sell the medication. So you have actually taken to the account that there would be no approval, and that is actually a legal risk, etc., etc. Then it is about the scope of the patent. Uh, and that shall answer the question, does the patent really cover the product or process which we want to protect? Uh, or does it cover at least your own product, the product that you want it is that to be protected? Sometimes actually the patent is drafted so bad that the claim does not really cover what you want it to cover. So that is actually a question that can be answered by knowing the truth of the claim, and if you are part of that claim, yes or not. Then on the other aspect is, for example, the circumvention and breadth of coverage. In fact, another aspect is actually which third-party products does it cover also? So, in other words, can you be infringed by other third parties, let's say, products? And in that case, if it is the case, it might be actually a legal supplementary legal risk, because these might bring these let's say other competitor to try to invalidate your patent. Then the other question is about detectability and enforceability of that patent. So, for example, can the infringement of the patent be detected? Or on the other side, can the patent be enforced? You have to know that for certain cases where the patent is part of, let's say, essential standard patents, you are obliged to accept FRAND licenses. That is an obligation, and the judge will not hear you if you say, actually, he is infringing my patent and I don't want that he does it. He says, no problem. There is actually a FRAND license agreement on that. That is an essential patent. So even if he infringes, he has just to pay, let's say, these license fee. So These seven uh, legal aspects, they are complete and they are disjoint. Uh, Now you have to think, are there any different, let's say, aspects that could be relevant, which is disjoint, and it is not in that list or not? Um, my thought was actually this is a complete and a disjoint list, so that is actually one possible example. There are different lists imaginable. You can think of your own list and do actually your own due diligence risk. What matters is, in fact, to care about that due diligence. So you care about the risks that might be there, be it legal or technical risks. So that brings us to the summary of this session. Uh, and one thing, what I wanted that you keep in mind is that IP valuation, in particular patent valuation, is in fact context dependent. So it depends always on the context of the valuation. You cannot make evaluation without taking into consideration what the context is. Some, let's say, keynotes that you have to take with you from these modules. First of all, we learned that the value is a concept. It is nothing with, which is inherent to an object. It is inherent to a good. There is nothing like, let's say, objective value of a good. Uh, it is just a concept, and it depends on the context and all the situation, and that will be determined by what comes. Then the difference between price, cost, and value. We learned about that. We know what is the cost, which are the assets you put in order to create, let's say, a good or service. Then the price is the outcome of a negotiation, and the value is about the future benefits. So that is actually how we discussed what is the difference between price, cost, and value. One thing that you shall have learned up until now. Then, as a evaluator, you shall analyze the context thoroughly. You can, in fact, take into consideration all parts of the context in order to analyze that. But don't forget that is the basics for the valuation. And then there are different valuation approaches for a different context. Some of them might work for some, let's say, valuation context, some for the other one. So you remember there were actually two, three different type of it. It was actually the one which was the price income approaches, cost approaches, and then also market approaches. All three might have some, let's say, reasonable situation where you can apply them, and all three have the reason a reason to be existence. Last but not least, don't forget your due diligence. So uh, valuation straightforward just by taking into account the economical effects is in fact incomplete because you neglected the risks. So you shall not neglect these risks. You shall do your due diligence, be it legal or technical. And the real value is in fact a value which takes into account all three factors: economic factors, legal factors, and let's say also the technical factors. So all three together would give the value, a comprehensive value.